The media loves to scare us, doesn't it? It loves to amp up any crisis to try and put us in a state of perpetual fear. Unless it's a problem that doesn't fit their narrative, that is. And then they simply pretend it isn't happening. The reason for this focus is simple. Fear sells. And the media is not really interested in outdated concepts like objectivity, impartiality, or truth. They're interested in pushing their agenda. They're interested in ratings. And they're interested in the money that comes with press sales and viewing figures. So any way to sex up that alarm is seized on with the enthusiasm of a starving man attacking a juicy steak. As such, they're continually hyping up the alarm we should feel over Brexit, Donald Trump, climate change, COVID, and racism. They're adamant that these evil spectres will doom us all, despite the fact that they have a pretty negligible effect on the lives of the vast majority of people. But never mind that. They don't want to let reality get in the way of a good story. They're not interested in facts that counter their alarmist fears. So they exaggerate. They omit inconvenient evidence. And more frequently, they just flat out lie. All while trumpeting their fact checkers and damning the fake news of the other side. And little excites their mendacious appetites more than COVID and racism. We saw this all too clearly after the European Football Championships, where England, in typical style, lost on penalties to Italy. It just so happens that the 3 players who missed their penalties were black, and a few idiots took to the internet to spew racist abuse. The number of verified incidents of this were 5. Yes, 5. Which in a nation of over 55 million people isn't many. But our largely left-leaning media is determined to claim that racism is everywhere, systemically infesting every aspect of our society. And so they seized on these insubstantial crumbs and trumpeted them as proof of all their most alarmist claims. That Britain is simply a sewer of vile, knuckle-dragging, racist scum. But, inconveniently, the vast majority of the population refused to play ball. Because while 5 people posted abuse, hundreds of thousands went public with supportive messages, gushing endorsements full of praise for Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, and Bukayo Saka. So how did the media react to this? How did they respond to the fact that 99.9% of the population stood up to oppose racism? How did they treat the overwhelming evidence that contradicted the narrative they want to push? Well, that was simple. In true Stalinist style, they simply ignored it. They turned their backs on objective reality and pretended that it didn't exist. Confronted with a ratio of 1,000 to 1 that proved England isn't a racist country, they just pretended that 99.9% of the evidence didn't exist, and that 0.1% of the evidence constituted the real story. Because that's the one that fits their narrative, that stokes outrage, that sells papers and gets viewers. But the picture printed in the media bore no resemblance to reality. It's also undeniable that where white players have missed penalties for England, they've received much worse abuse than Rashford, Sancho and Saka. The whole episode was evidence not of how racist Britain is, but of how tolerant it is. Now, there are many euphemistic terms that could be used to explain this sleight of hand, but there's only one that confronts it directly. They are lying. They are spouting absolutely shameless, barefaced, outrageous and mountainous lies. To examine a situation, to ignore 99% of the evidence, and to pretend that the tiniest sample imaginable represents the story is simply despicable behaviour, especially for those with enough chutzpah to still claim that they care about objectivity, transparency, impartiality, or journalistic honesty and integrity. It's a shockingly corrupt dereliction of duty. And it also serves to stoke up the sort of division and racism that they claim to care about. Now, many also took this opportunity to make connections between those isolated cases of racist abuse and the fans who had booed when players took the knee. And this too is simply brazen lying, casually making a correlation between two actions which bear no relation to each other at all. Because it may surprise such people to learn that it's possible to oppose the racism of a tiny group of England fans and to oppose the racism of BLM. Such Puritans are now making efforts to force people to kneel by invoking the spectre of racism. Ironically, that's exactly the agree with us or you're a fascist tactic that prompted people to boo in the first place. Still, at least these activists have settled the debate. The kneeling at football is nothing at all to do with Black Lives Matter. Nope. Absolutely no connection between the kneeling and Black Lives Matter at all. So, glad we got that sorted. Still, as bad as these lies were, the fibs now being told about COVID are even worse. Britain ended its COVID restrictions recently, and the results have defied expectations. Because with the country opening up, with masks no longer compulsory, the rate of infections has started tumbling. They've been falling for several weeks straight, falling so sharply that there are now nearly 30,000 fewer positive tests every single day. More than this, the link between infection and serious illness or death has been broken. Similar rates in January saw about 1,500 people a day dying, but now the figure is about 20 a day, and nearly all from those who refuse the vaccine. So surely this good news has been trumpeted by the media. Not a bit of it. Because the lies they started telling then were even more outrageous. The BBC in particular simply threw out headlines and articles in direct contradiction to observed reality. After stoking up the fear for so long they couldn't admit that they were wrong, like they were about Brexit and virtually everything else. So they started rewriting reality in a manner that would make Mao or Stalin blush. And these lies are even more brazen than the blatant fibs they pushed about the football. Now, eventually, the BBC were forced to admit the falling figures. But it came with a caveat. The majority of their article was full of dire warnings on how pessimistic observers expect the figures to rise again in the near future. Because speculation that supports their narrative is preferred to actual evidence that contradicts it. Sajid Javid had, quite rightly, told people to stop cowering about COVID. But all the self-righteous Puritans on Twitter, the thin-skinned bullies who swallowed every bit of fear-mongering the media have forced on them, howled with indignation and forced him to apologise. But he shouldn't have. Because it's time to tell these spineless harridans to get lost. It's time to stop believing the grossly inflated lies the media are feeding us all the time. It really is time to stop cowering. To stand up and to count our blessings. The most alarmist view of society is a long way from the most accurate. We don't live in an endemically racist state. COVID has little effect on 99.8% of the population, and we have a vaccine now. Brexit wasn't the disaster they claimed, and climate change isn't going to destroy the planet and kill us all. We don't live in the nightmare world painted by the media. We live in paradise. Seriously. Stop panicking, stop believing the hype, and count your blessings. We're the luckiest people in history. It's time to start acting like it. If you've enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in extensive detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.